"Please, just one loaf," she begged the baker. His cold refusal would uncover a 25-year-old secret. The air in Gunter's bakery was a tomb, thick with the ghosts of flour and the oppressive silence of 25 winters. Lingering grief and cold resignation clung to the claustrophobic space, a monument built of stale bread and regret. His hands gnarled as old roots worked the dough on the bench below. The movement was a punishment, not a passion, a mechanical rhythm he had perfected to keep the memories at bay. Each fold, each press was a prayer to the family he had failed. He had promised his daughter the world a future bought with gold. Instead, he'd returned to a silent cabin and a life sentence of his own making. The wind howled outside, sounding like it was hell-bent for leather, but another sound sliced through the quiet. A small, desperate rap on the frosted door. A sound that had no place in his self-made prison. A sound that promised to break more than just the silence. The knock was a thief. It stole the silence Gunter had spent 25 years perfecting. 3 soft, desperate taps, no louder than a dying heartbeat, yet they crashed through the thick air of the bakery like a hammer through glass. He stood frozen, his hands buried in a mountain of lifeless dough. Outside, the wind howled a familiar Wyoming lullaby. But this was different. This was human, an unwelcome prayer at the door of his tomb. He moved with the heavy grace of a man long resigned to his ghosts, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Each step was a penance. The bakery was his cell, the scent of yeast and cold ash his sacrament. He unlatched the heavy oak door, pulling it inward just enough to peer out. The cold bit him a serpent's fang of ice and wind. It brought with it 2 figures etched against the swirling gray twilight. A woman and a child, their forms blurred by the falling snow. The woman's face was sharp with a hunger that went deeper than her belly. It was the hunger for a future she wasn't sure would come. The child, a small bundle of rags hid behind her mother's tattered skirt, only a pair of wide, terrified eyes visible. Drifters, Gunter thought the word a piece of grit in his mind. Grub-line riders trading stories for scraps. He had nothing for them. "Please, sir," the woman's voice was thin, nearly stolen by the wind. "A loaf. Anything. We have coin." Gunter's gaze was flat, a frozen lake. Closed. The word was a stone dropped in a well. He began to push the door shut to reclaim his sacred quiet, to banish the specters of need from his sight. He saw the woman's shoulders slump, the final ember of hope dying in her eyes. The sight stirred something deep and terrible within him, a memory of another face, another winter. Shame burned in his gut. He pushed the feeling down hard and squared his shoulders to close the door for good. Wait. The cry was sharp, desperate. He paused, his hand on the wood. The woman Ada fumbled in a small pouch at her waist. Her fingers, blue with cold, emerged not with a coin, but with a small dark object. She held it out in her trembling palm, a desperate final offering. And Gunter's world stopped turning. It wasn't a jewel. It wasn't money. It was a bird carved from a single piece of pine, its wings worn smooth by the passage of a lifetime. A songbird with a broken wing. An ace in the hole he'd carved on a sunny afternoon to make a little girl smile, a promise of spring in a world that had only given them winter. His breath caught in his throat. The door hung open, forgotten. The fortress he had built around his heart was under siege not by an army, but by the ghost of a wooden bird. For a moment time ceased to be a river and became a single frozen lake. The wooden bird in the woman's palm was not an object. It was an anchor, and it was pulling Gunter down through 25 years of ice. He was no longer standing at the door of his cold bakery in 1885. He was in the sun-drenched yard of his past, the scent of pine shavings sharp in the air. A younger Gunter, with laughter lines around his eyes, held a carving knife. A little girl with hair the color of wheat, as Lena danced around his feet. "Is it for me, Papa?" her voice was the melody he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. "For you, and you alone, mein Schatz," he had answered, smoothing the bird's wing. "So, you will always have a song even when the world is quiet." The memory was a warm, golden honey that instantly turned to poison in his veins. The cold of the present slapped him back with brutal force. The woman, Ada, was still there, her expression shifting from desperation to confusion. The child, Clara, peeked out from behind her, a silent witness. His own hand, a traitor to the fortress he had built, lifted as if of its own accord. His fingers, trembling, brushed against the worn wood of the bird. It was real. This ghost was real. A sound tore from his throat, something between a word and a wound. Where Ada flinched at the raw sound of his voice, but she held her ground. Her chin lifted with that stubborn pride he was beginning to recognize. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice steady despite the cold. It was all she had left of her father. He made it for her. Her name was Lena. Lena. The name was not a memory. It was a physical blow. It struck him in the chest, knocking the air from his lungs, shattering the dam of grief he had so carefully constructed. For a quarter of a century he had buried that name under layers of bitterness and mechanical routine. Now it was unearthed, and it brought the whole graveyard of his heart up with it. He saw his daughter's face not in a fond memory, but as she must have been in the end, alone, terrified, freezing. And this woman, this granddaughter he never knew existed, was the living proof of his failure. She was the result of a life his daughter had lived entirely without him. He staggered backward, away from the door, away from the truth. "No," he whispered the word, dissolving into a choked sob. He looked at Ada, at the shape of her eyes. Lena's eyes, and the sight was an accusation. He looked at the child Clara and saw every child the world had ever abandoned. The pain was too immense, a tidal wave of pure agony. It was not the gentle sorrow of reunion. It was the violent, jagged horror of a wound ripped open. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't look at them. They were not family. They were monuments to his sin. "Leave," the word exploded from him, a roar of anguish that shook the very jars on his shelves. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Get out." He lunged forward, grabbing the heavy oak door and slamming it shut with all the force of his despair. The sound cracked through the twilight like a rifle shot. With fumbling, panicked hands, he threw the heavy iron bolt. The screech of the metal was the only sound that could match the scream trapped in his own soul. Silence returned. On the other side of the door, two shadows stood in the falling snow. On the inside, Gunter's back slid down the rough wood until he sat crumpled on the floor. He buried his face in his hands, a broken man in a tomb of his own, making finally utterly alone with his ghosts. The bolt slid home with the sound of a jailer locking a cell. But Gunter was not the jailer. He was the prisoner. He collapsed against the heavy oak, his back to the door, the cold seeping through the wood into his very bones. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was not the peaceful monastic quiet he had curated for a quarter of a century. It was a screaming, accusing void, filled with the echoes of a woman's plea and a name he had tried to bury. Lena. He pushed himself to his feet and began to pace a caged animal in a den of his own making. The warm, yeasty air of the bakery, once his shield, now felt suffocating. Every object was a torment. The flour sacks, plump and full, mocked the memory of his wife's gaunt face. The roaring fire in the hearth felt like a sin against the memory of her shivering form. He had hoarded this warmth, this life, while his own blood had frozen in the wilderness. The gold can wait Gunter, his wife's voice, a ghost in his ear. Just stay. But he hadn't stayed. He had ridden out full of foolish pride, a man fixin' to conquer the world for them, only to return and find he had lost the world entirely. He had traded their lives for a handful of dust and a lifetime of regret. The weight of it pressed down on him, a physical force that made it hard to breathe. He was a man drowning on dry land. Hours bled into one another. The storm outside raged its fury, a pale imitation of the tempest in his soul. He found himself drawn to the window, a moth to a flame he despised. He scraped a small circle in the frost with his thumbnail, expecting to see nothing but an empty, snow-swept street. He hoped with a desperate and ugly part of his heart that they were gone, that the ghosts had finally moved on. But they were still there. They had found the slightest of shelters in an alcove by the chimney where a faint, pathetic warmth bled through the stone. The woman, Ada, had taken off her own threadbare coat and wrapped it around the child, leaving her own arms bare to the biting wind. She was hunched over the small form, her body a fragile shield. He could see her mouth moving, and though he could not hear the words, he knew she was singing a lullaby into the storm. It was an act of such raw, defiant love that it struck Gunter with more force than the blizzard itself. It was the last stand of a mother against the cruelty of the world. It was everything he should have done. The sight broke him. The battle he had been fighting since he heard that knock on the door, the war he had been fighting for 25 years, was over. His fortress had not been taken by force. It had crumbled from the inside, undone by the sight of a love he recognized and had failed. He stepped back from the window, his movements slow, deliberate. The anger was gone. The rage was gone. All that remained was a vast, hollow emptiness. He walked to the door, his boots heavy as lead. His hand closed around the cold iron of the bolt. For a long moment he just stood there, his forehead pressed against the wood. Then, with a shuddering breath that felt like his last, he pulled it back. The screech of the metal was deafening. He opened the door. The wind and snow rushed in, extinguishing a candle on the counter. Ada looked up, her face a pale mask of shock and disbelief, her arms still wrapped around her sleeping child. Her eyes asked a question she did not have the strength to speak. Gunter's own voice was a stranger, a rasp of gravel and rust. "Get in." Ada stepped across the threshold, and the world shifted. It was not a grand entrance, but a quiet, hesitant crossing from one hell into another. Outside lay the hell of ice and wind, a clean, honest killer. Inside was Gunter's domain, a hell of warmth and ghosts, thick with the cloying scent of memory and stale air. Snow from their clothes melted onto the floorboards, creating dark, weeping puddles. The child, Clara, coughed a small, dry cough that seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Gunter shut the door, the sound a final heavy punctuation mark on his surrender. He did not speak. He did not know the words. For 25 years, his only conversations had been with the specters of his own making. He simply gestured with his chin toward the stone hearth where the fire pulsed with a low, sullen light. It was a command, not an invitation. He watched from the shadows of his corner as Ada led the child to the fire. He watched as she peeled away the wet, frozen layers, chafing life back into the small red hands. Gunter moved like an automaton to the stove, ladling a thin, meaty stew into 2 bowls. He set them on the small, dusty table beside a thick slice of dark bread. He did not offer it. He merely placed it there, an offering to the ghosts who now wore flesh. Then he retreated back to his corner, a quiet observer in his own home. Ada settled the child at the table, first watching her eat with a fierce, protective gaze. Only when Clara had finished her small body, finally still did Ada lift her own spoon. She ate, slowly, methodically, not with the frantic hunger of a beggar, but with the measured pace of a survivor. When the bowls were empty, she rose, carried them to the wash basin, and began to clean them. The simple domestic act was a quiet rebellion. It was a declaration that she was not just a recipient of charity. She was a presence, a force of order in his chaos. Gunter watched, unsettled. The silence in the room was no longer his. It was shared, and in that sharing it had changed. As Ada put the clean bowls on a shelf, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. a small tarnished silver frame hiding under a shroud of flower dust. She picked it up, her thumb wiping a clean streak across the glass. It was a daguerreotype of a young girl, no older than 12, with a serious smile and eyes that held a universe of light. Gunter's breath hitched. He had forgotten it was even there. Ada turned, holding the frame. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. "She has your eyes." The words were a key, turning in a lock that had rusted shut. He could have stayed silent. He could have turned away. The old Gunter would have. But the fortress had been breached. The ghosts were already inside. He pushed himself from the wall, his voice a low rasp of unused chords. "I wasn't here." Ada weighted her gaze, steady, offering no pity, only a quiet space for the truth. There was a fever, he continued the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the fire, unable to meet her eyes, unable to look at the face in the frame. A storm. I was away. He swallowed the confession, a physical weight in his throat. I went chasing gold. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollowed-out pits of shame. He expected tears or accusations. Instead, Ada simply gave a slow, solemn nod. An acknowledgement. She gently placed the photograph back on the mantelpiece, handling it not like a stranger's memory, but like a piece of her own history she was just discovering. The fire crackled, filling the new silence. Clara, warm and full for the first time in days, had curled up on a small rug by the hearth, fast asleep. A child sleeping by the fire. A mother watching over her. It was a perfect picture of peace, painted directly over the canvas of his life's greatest tragedy. Gunter stood in the shadows, a ghost in his own home, watching a life he never knew he'd lost begin to breathe again in the ruins. A new rhythm settled into the bakery, quiet and fragile. It was a rhythm not of words but of movements. The scrape of a chair on the floorboards. The soft hiss of the fire as Ada stoked it back to life each morning before Gunter even rose. The rustle of Clara's small feet as she explored the corners of this strange, warm cave that had become her world. Gunter watched it all from the periphery, a sentinel in his own life. He found himself performing small, unconscious acts of service that felt foreign and unsettling. He'd leave an extra log by the hearth. He'd add more vegetables to the stew he cooked for them, his own portion suddenly seeming too large. One morning, he tore a small piece of sweet dough from his own private stock and left it on the counter, watching from the shadows as Clara discovered it, her eyes going wide with a delight so pure it was almost painful to witness. This new life was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred grief he had nursed for a quarter of a century. Yet the silence it filled was a silence he was slowly realizing he had grown to hate. He saw Ada move about the bakery with a pragmatic purpose, her hands always busy, her posture straight and proud. She was not a guest awaiting charity. She was a survivor carving out a space. She would sweep the floors, her brow furrowed in concentration, or sit quietly, mending a tear in Clara's dress, her every action a testament to an unbreakable inner strength. He saw his Lena in her, not in the face, but in the spirit. It was a stubborn, resilient spirit that the world had tried and failed to break. The peace, such as it was shattered by the ringing of the bell above the door. The man who entered was Silas Croft. He was the owner of the town's mercantile, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He moved with a slick confidence, his fine wool coat a stark contrast to the threadbare poverty of the town. He brought the scent of expensive tobacco and the chill of the outside world in with him. "Gunter, my good man Croft," began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He nodded curtly at Ada, his gaze dismissing her as part of the furniture. A brutal winter. Simply brutal. Bad for the people, of course, but an opportunity for men of foresight. Gunter said nothing, his hand stilling over his dough. He knew this kind of man. He had met them at the Gold Creek men who would sell their own mothers for a rumor of fortune. Croft leaned against the counter, his tone conspiratorial. I hear you have a substantial supply of flour. The town's reserves are gone. The next supply train won't make it through the pass for a month, maybe more." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm prepared to buy your entire stock. All of it. At a premium, of course. A generous price for your foresight." The old Gunter stirred within him. The Gunter who had ridden off in search of gold would have seen the logic. The money could secure their survival for the rest of the winter and beyond. It was a practical solution, a fortress of coin against the wolves of starvation. He could feel the old familiar ambition whispering to him, tempting him with the very same promise that had led to his ruin. He was hesitating. He hated himself for it. It was Ada who broke the spell. She had been standing silently by the hearth, but now she stepped forward. She was not addressing Croft, but Gunter. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room with the sharpness of a blade. "My husband's wagon train paid a man like him for supplies before we crossed the high pass," she said, her eyes locked on Gunter. "He took our money and gave us half of what he promised. We ran out of food a week later. My husband, he did not survive." She turned her gaze to Croft, and for the first time the man's smile faltered. There was no pleading in her eyes, only a cold, hard-won wisdom. "Flour is just dust in a rich man's cellar, sir. It only becomes life when it's made into bread for the hungry." Her words were a bolt of lightning illuminating the dark corners of Gunter's soul. He looked at Ada, truly looked at her, and saw not just the ghost of his daughter, but a woman of fierce moral clarity. She had just handed him back his own soul. Gunter straightened up to his full height, the baker's stoop vanishing, replaced by something rigid and unbending. He wiped his floured hands on his apron and looked Silas Croft dead in the eye. "The flour is not for sale," he said, his voice flat and final. Croft's mask of civility dropped. "Don't be a fool, old man. This is business. The bakery is open," Gunter stated, his voice growing stronger. "Bread is 5 cents a loaf. For anyone who has need. That is my business." For a long moment Croft stared, his face contorting in a sneer of disbelief. "You're a sentimental old fool, Gunter," he spat. "When your charity runs dry and that girl of yours is crying from hunger, don't come to my store for help." He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that returned this time was different. It was not empty. It was filled with a newfound strength, a shared resolve. Gunter looked at Ada, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes that was more eloquent than any words. She simply nodded back. His gaze fell upon Clara, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He walked slowly to the mantelpiece, his old knees protesting, and took down the wooden bird. He knelt before the small child, an act of supplication and grace. He held out the bird. "This," he started, his voice thick with emotion, "this was your great-grandmother's. Your mother's mother. My Lena." Clara reached out her small fingers and touched the smooth wood. Gunter closed her hand around it. "He made it for her, she told you, to be a promise of a song." He looked from the child to her mother, his granddaughter. "The song is yours now. It belongs to this house." He had finally passed on his legacy, not of grief, but of a promise he was finally ready to keep. The thaw came not as a single event, but as a slow, hesitant surrender. It began as a whisper in the wind, a subtle shift in the air that no longer carried the scent of pure, sterile ice, but the damp, rich promise of earth. Gunter would stand at his door in the early mornings, watching as the iron-hard grip of winter slowly lost its strength. Water dripped from the eaves, each drop a tick of a clock counting towards spring. The mountain peaks, once sharp and cruel against a gray sky, seemed to soften in the pale yellow light. The world was learning how to breathe again, and inside the bakery, so was Gunter. The silence in his home had transformed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb, but a quiet filled with the small, essential sounds of life. the soft thrum of Ada's humming as she mended a seam, the light rhythmic patter of Clara's bare feet on the wooden floorboards, the occasional burst of a child's laughter, a sound so alien and bright it felt like a sunbeam piercing through the dusty air. At first, these sounds had been an intrusion, a violation. Now he found they were the very things holding the walls up. They were the sounds he had been starving for, a nourishment he never knew he needed. One morning, as he watched Ada effortlessly shaping the day's loaves with a natural inherited grace, he knew it was time. The knowledge came to him not as a thought, but as a deep, settled certainty. His hands, gnarled by age and stiffened by sorrow, were no longer the best instruments for this craft. His legacy was not in his own 2 hands anymore. The dough, he said, his voice quiet but clear across the room. Ada looked up, her own hands white with flour. It needs a lighter touch, a woman's touch. He paused, the words feeling new and strange in his mouth. Your hands are better suited than mine now. It is time you learned the heart of it, not just the work. Ada's eyes widened slightly, understanding the weight of the offer. It was more than a lesson. It was an inheritance. She nodded a silent acceptance, and so he began to teach her. It was a slow and sacred ritual. He didn't just give commands. He shared the soul of the bread. He showed her how to listen to the dough, how to feel for the moment the yeast truly came alive. You feel that he would murmur, his rough fingers guiding her hand over the supple dough. That is the life in it. It breathes same as us. You must not crush it. You must help it rise. He taught her the secrets his own father had taught him in a sun-drenched German kitchen, an ocean and a lifetime away. How a pinch of sugar could awaken the yeast, how a splash of milk could soften the crust, how the timing of the bake was not about the clock, but about the color, the smell, the hollow sound the loaf made when tapped. He was not just giving her a recipe, he was giving her the story of his life, a story he was finally rewriting. Clara would help her small hands making a glorious mess, dusting her own nose with flour and leaving tiny handprints on the sacks. Gunter, who once would have bristled at the disorder, now found himself watching her with a quiet smile. He would roll a small piece of dough into a snake for her to play with the act, feeling more natural than anything he had done in years. In these moments, surrounded by the warmth and the rising scent of baking bread, he was not a hermit or a ghost. He was a father, a grandfather. He was simply Gunter. One afternoon, as the last of the snow melted away to reveal the dark, hungry earth, Gunter saw Ada kneeling by the front porch. She was digging in the cold, damp soil with her bare hands. He walked out, the unfamiliar warmth of the sun on his face. "What are you doing?" he asked. Ada looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Planting," she said simply. She gestured to the bare patch of ground. "My mother, your Lena, she always said that even the hardest ground deserved a flower. She said beauty was an act of defiance against a world that was often ugly." She looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. "I thought this place deserved some defiance." Gunter was silent for a long moment, his heart aching with a new and beautiful memory of the daughter he had lost. He had only remembered her as a child. He had never known the woman she had become, a woman who taught her own daughter about defiant beauty. He turned and went back inside the bakery. He returned a moment later with a small folded paper packet yellowed with age. "My Annalise," he said, his voice thick. "She saved these. Every year. Seeds from her flowers back home." He held out the packet to Ada. She always said she would plant them when the house felt right. Tears welled in Ada's eyes as she took the fragile packet. She was holding the legacy of a grandmother she had never met, a gift from a woman who had also believed in growing flowers on stone. Weeks passed. Spring arrived in earnest, painting the hills in tentative shades of green. The town of Dry Stone had survived the winter, sustained in large part by the steady supply of bread from Gunter's bakery. The doors were often open now, letting in the fresh air and the sounds of the reviving town. One bright, clear morning, Gunter was outside with a small can of black paint and a fine brush. Ada watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed, a knowing smile on her face. The old sign, weathered by decades of sun and sorrow, read simply, Gunter's Bakery. With a slow, steady hand, Gunter dipped the brush in the paint. He didn't paint and granddaughter as would have been factually correct. He painted the title that his heart had conferred upon her. He painted the correction for his past, the promise for his future. When he was finished, the sign read, Gunter and Daughter Bakery. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch steps as the sun bled orange and purple across the vast western sky. It was the first time Gunter had willingly sat outside to watch a sunset in 25 years. Ada had baked the day's final loaf, and its crust was perfect. She broke off a piece and handed it to him. He took it. The bread was warm, the air was cool. The child Clara leaned sleepily against his side, the old wooden bird clutched in her hand. Gunter looked at Ada, at the quiet strength in her face, and then at the endless sky above them. His heart, for the first time in a lifetime, was quiet. Not the dead, hollow quiet of a tomb. It was the peaceful living quiet of a home.